sophisticated weapons systems, high-tech surveillance, the mysterious tools of the trade for espionage, drones, satellites, and even the internet. The last century has seen an explosion in war and intelligence agency technology. Yet these systems are sophisticated and take time to build. If you have an idea, you can't just go out for venture funding. So who actually pays to get this technology built? Who are the financiers of spycraft and war? The post-war world has a long history of government-backed science, technology, and research. Yet despite the legendary stories of old, most of it does not look like the Manhattan Project. These days, cutting-edge defense technology research is done in a gray area where investors, researchers, and government meet. So we are going to take a look at those gray channels where intelligence agencies meet Wall Street and get money to scientists. We will explore the world of secret technologies and their secret finance. This is the story of where secret agents and generals meet shadow capital and science. This is the story of In-Q-Tel and defense capital. It's the 1990s, and the Cold War has ended. The constant driving force behind military intervention is no longer there. And all while internet technology booms, with investors piling fortunes into .coms. The commercial technology being innovated in Silicon Valley began to quickly outstrip the research and development of traditional government-funded programs. And so on the part of defense and intelligence officials alike, it was beginning to become clear that traditional government procurement mechanisms were too slow and too rigid to keep up with the fast-moving software and hardware breakthroughs underway. Dr. Ruth David, the Deputy Director for Science and Technology at the CIA, began thinking quite seriously about this problem. How could the CIA possibly keep up with the sheer pace of innovation in Silicon Valley? She would begin pushing for new mechanisms to leverage commercial technology. In 1998, this sentiment would be mirrored by Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet, who recognized the growing technology gap between the intelligence community and private industry. He would champion a quite novel concept, creating a private, non-profit venture capital firm funded by the government to act as a bridge between Silicon Valley and national security agencies. DCI Tenet would commission Norman Augustine, the former CEO of Lockheed Martin, and they would pull together a steering committee to design a venture capital model tailored for national security and intelligence. Beginning in February 1999, the agency would charter a 501c3 non-profit organization, incorporated under the name Peleus, later In-Q-It, before finally landing on the name In-Q-Tel, or IQT, the Q said to be a nod to the James Bond quartermaster. They would bring on Gilman Louie, a veteran interactive entertainment executive and flight simulator director, to become the firm's founding CEO, while Norman Augustine would chair the initial board of trustees. Yet, owing to the sensitive nature of what this firm was dealing with, there were a few tricky snags that needed to be addressed, not as straightforward as a normal venture capital firm. In order to handle the classified requirements without bottlenecking private startups, the CIA would establish the QIC, the In-Q-Tel Interface Center, to act as an internal liaison. In-Q-Tel would open its first Silicon Valley office in Menlo Park, California, in 2000, positioning itself directly within the venture capital ecosystem. Now the CIA truly had a venture capital firm of its own, able to deploy vast capital backed by the government. And so, with their new venture arm, over the following years, they would broaden their intelligence base. In 2001, they would bring on the National Imagery and Mapping Agency, today the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, becoming the first outside agency partner to join In-Q-Tel. They would begin making investments in novel technologies, anything which they believed could have intelligence applications. In 2003, they would make one of their most notable investments, a landmark deployment into Keyhole, a 3D geospatial visualization startup. Keyhole's technology was rapidly deployed to support troops in Iraq, and as well minted In-Q-Tel quite a nice return, as the following year, in 2004, the company would be acquired by Google to become the basis of Google Earth, with In-Q-Tel selling its equity stake in Google, acquired via Keyhole, for over $2.2 million. That year, they would bring on the FBI and Defense Intelligence Agency to join as partners. And so the firm would grow and become increasingly sophisticated. They would bring on Chris Darby as president and CEO in 2006, with as well Steve Bauscher joining as managing general partner. This leadership change would begin a strategic pivot, refocusing In-Q-Tel toward long-term enterprise technologies. They would expand East Coast operations, opening an office in Waltham, Massachusetts, and as well bring on the TSA, NSA, and National Reconnaissance Office as further funding partners to the firm. During these years, toward the end of the 2000s, they would begin investing much more heavily into cybersecurity, with one of their most notable investments being FireEye. The 2010s would continue their process of expansion. In 2010, the Department of Homeland Security would join as a partner, and these years would see a new technology very much at the top of the minds of the firm, the nexus of artificial intelligence and machine learning. To this end, in 2012, In-Q-Tel would launch Lab 41, later to evolve into IQT Labs. It was to be an in-house research group focused on the practical applications of AI and machine learning, all geared toward the aims of national security and intelligence. In 2016, In-Q-Tel would launch SpaceNet, an open-source collaboration with NVIDIA and Radiant Solutions, with the aim to make high-resolution satellite imagery datasets available for machine learning research. And though one might think that these are American intelligence agencies, and so their work would be heavily guarded domestically, the CIA has always been a little bit more international than is readily disclosed to the public, with apparatuses like the Five Eyes really quite heavily interwoven. The firm would expand internationally, opening an office in London in 2018 and Sydney in 2019, with US Cyber Command partnering with In-Q-Tel around the same time, bringing the focus much more towards cyber technologies, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. In 2020, the firm would reach 500 total lifetime investments, showing that In-Q-Tel had truly become a quite powerful venture capital firm. And this was not just government money going to research, but was as well highly adept investing. That year, they would launch IQT Emerge, aiming to commercialize dual-use government technologies. And the concept of dual-use technologies is really at the heart of In-Q-Tel's strategy. If you finance and build something that has useful government application, you may get a strong return from government contracts. Yet this isn't necessarily guaranteed, as you must fit exactly what the government needs and get someone to sign off on it, but also creates a single point of failure with a single customer. And so if you can create a technology that also has use out in the market, then that allows you to fulfill your national security and intelligence purpose, but as well have a chance at making returns in the open market, fulfilling your mandate, and making you money. Particularly as this dual-use space was becoming more sophisticated and complex, in 2022, In-Q-Tel would create the Government Platform Accelerator. The program would assist venture-backed startups in navigating defense and intelligence market adoption. And this is when we start seeing the rise of some of the newer Silicon Valley defense contractors, the ones that are very much in the news today, like Palantir and Anduril. You know, the Lord of the Rings ones. And so the past few years have seen no signs of In-Q-Tel slowing down. They're just as active as ever, and growing. Steve Bauscher would succeed Chris Darby as president and CEO in 2023, with the same year the firm opening offices in Singapore and Munich. They would as well add the Office of Naval Research, CENTCOM, and the Department of Defense as partners that year. Yet perhaps the most interesting addition as partner would be the Office of Strategic Capital, and this is an entity that we will need to explore further. The following year, US Space Force would join as a partner, and in just the past year, the firm closed its 800th investment, with their portfolio presently spanning deep technological domains, including artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, space systems, and microelectronics. In-Q-Tel is really at the cutting edge, and in many ways they look quite similar to other Silicon Valley venture firms. If you stack them up against Andreessen Horowitz, Sequoia, or Founders Fund, you might think of them as much the same thing. Yet all the while, there's a secretive layer to what they're doing, and they have staggering government backing. Yet to great extent, they are really able to survive on their own investment acumen. They are a highly successful venture firm. And as time has gone on, that divide between In-Q-Tel, intelligence venture, and the venture firms of Silicon Valley has grown fuzzier. They have a great deal of dealings with firms like Andreessen Horowitz. And as these new type of defense firms like Anduril or Palantir have risen, this has created a new class of investor founder. And so the gray area in Silicon Valley has become wider, and many in the valley have become much more closely drawn to defense and intelligence development. Yet let's take a closer look at the Office of Strategic Capital, as this is an entity which may play an increasingly more dominant role over the coming years. In many ways, it's almost like a 19th century national investment bank, and it has been getting geared to reshoring and reindustrialization. And with the OSC as a partner in In-Q-Tel, all while housed under the Department of War, it is a quite curious and important player. In the Montpelierian neoliberal world, people have been told a binary story. The idea is that there are two fundamentally different models for the economy. One is free, liberal, one where the government doesn't interfere, where markets are left to their own devices, where international firms invest and transact without barriers, while the other is one of top-down, heavy-handed state control, of a government who picks winners and losers, and commands the economy under its vision. Yet neither model has ever truly existed in the United States. The neoliberal free trade world is perhaps the most regulated the economy has ever been. Really, there isn't a binary, and there aren't these two polar extremes. The history of American economics is much more nuanced. And back in America's earlier history in the 19th century, there was a notion of national credit, one where credit flowed preferentially to entities who were constructing for common benefit. Investors in things like useful technologies, infrastructure, railroads, energy, and mining would gain preferential access to credit. These ideas all arising in a time where government control over industry was far less supported than now. National capital is not a novel concept, nor is it antithetical to a market where participants are free to trade, free from the heavy hand of an onerous regulatory state. In the past year, officials in the Trump White House have begun to speak of the Hamiltonian economic model, one mirrored by figures like Henry Clay, Abraham Lincoln, and William McKinley. And it appears as though many of these ideas are returning. For while neoliberal global free trade says all the right terms that to people sound like freedom, in practice it has created very heavy-handed control offshore, destroying domestic prosperity and hollowing out towns, all while power is consolidated and sovereignty eroded. To think in terms of state bad, non-state good is a far too simplistic model. If one wishes sovereignty in a free economy, what is truly the best way to get that done? Because handing all of your economic power to large consolidated entities offshore, destroying the quality of life for your labor force, and handing it to poor laborers and even slaves off in foreign lands, while the regulatory state turns the screws tighter and tighter, may not actually mean free in the way that people wish it did. And so, despite this binary that exists in the minds of so many people, despite the conditioning of free markets versus socialist government, it makes very good sense why the sovereigntist populists would be making such use of national credit. Perhaps there is no place where the idea of national credit is better on display than the Department of War's Office of Strategic Capital. So let's begin by taking a look back to 2018. In those years going into the early 2020s, defense leaders came to realize that there was a persistent valley of death, a space where hardware, deep tech, and microelectronic startups in particular ran out of venture funding before securing long-term defense procurement contracts. This is perhaps the most fundamental and persistent flaw within American venture capital. If you are attempting to develop something, particularly a novel and sophisticated technology, yet it will take many, many years, longer than the life cycle of a venture fund, then it is extraordinarily difficult to get investors, for which investor would back a 20-year project with very high uncertainty. This was the gap that the Department of Defense came to look at. On December 1st of 2022, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin formally established the Office of Strategic Capital, setting it up within the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Its founding directive was to crowd in private capital into technologies vital to national security. In September the following year, the Office of Strategic Capital would launch its first formal initiative in partnership with the Small Business Administration, named the Small Business Investment Company Critical Technologies Initiative. The program provided credit and leverage to private investment funds deploying into defense-critical technology areas. The ultimate strategic vision: to fill in credit into that gap that investors were leaving open and unfunded, particularly where firms were developing technologies that could be useful for the Department of Defense. The office would be formally codified into law in December of 2023, with Congress's passage of the NDAA 2024. This would confer explicit statutory authority to issue direct loans, loan guarantees, and technical assistance across 31 covered technology categories under Title 10. In March of 2024, the office would release its inaugural fiscal year 2024 investment strategy, detailing how it would target lower-level component and supply chain technologies rather than end-item platforms. And by the end of that year, it would launch its equipment finance program, marking a transition into direct lending to private companies. These loans would be provided for the purchase of modernization or expansion of high-tech manufacturing equipment. And yet, as the Trump administration would enter the White House, the office would significantly ramp up and shift its scope to a larger vision. Its fiscal year 2025 investment strategy would set out formal selection criteria for issuing direct loans aimed to shore up domestic industry. And over the past year, the office has really expanded to address the question of how to shore up domestic key industries, continuing for both defense financing, but as well critical supply chains and manufacturing. Rather than purchasing finished capabilities, the OSC targets components and supply chains. Some of its key domains today are critical minerals, advanced semiconductors, microelectronics, quantum sensing, biomanufacturing, and advanced materials. It appears as though the Office of Strategic Capital is being used as a very key entity in the shoring up of the domestic supply chain, yet also in the rebuilding of domestic industry and reshoring. Its main financial avenues are direct lending and equipment finance, offering low-cost federal loans to tech manufacturers and firms expanding commercial scale. The office has launched its SBI-CCT initiative, partnering with Small Business Administration licensed private funds to match government finance against private equity investments. Another one of its most crucial products is National Security Fund Finance, where the office provides credit and debt assistance specifically targeting key supply vulnerabilities. In many ways, it's a line of defense for domestic security, as it is a liquidity pump for domestic industry. Perhaps in its own way, it can be thought of as dual use, building out the sectors and supply chains that are vital for defense, yet also mining, minerals, energy, and crucial infrastructure, all while backing cutting-edge technologies and crucial hardware, things that are yes needed for military applications, but as well serve as the backbone for the American economy, certainly the real economy. The office has laid out its future plans and strategy. The office's financial vision really rests on three core fundamental pillars. 1. Restoring domestic critical minerals and mineral supply chains. The OSC introduced the National Security Fund Finance Program. Fueled by target funding initiatives, the program provides fund-level loans to qualified private fund managers, combining OSC backing with private credit, really expanding the investment base in companies of key importance. Its second key pillar can be broken up into a three-part phrase: components, not capabilities; finance, not innovation; and lending, not spending. So, components, not capabilities. The office aims at securing lower-tier supplies, components like sensors, power cells, and chips, rather than large, sophisticated weapons systems themselves. Finance, not innovation. The office has decided to leave research and development to agencies like DARPA, all while focusing on scaling manufacturing capacity. You can't have any of that complex, fancy stuff without having the core base components. And last, lending, not spending. The OSC aims to not be a funder on its own, but to work as part of a multiplier with Wall Street. Relying on loans and guarantees, the office works to stretch taxpayer dollars by mobilizing vastly larger pools of private Wall Street and Silicon Valley capital, quite often forming their investments as co-invests. The last of these pillars is deepening allied partnerships. Going forward, the OSC is structuring programs to attract allied capital from NATO, AUKUS, and Indo-Pacific partners. The aim is to create joint resilient supply chains, not only domestically, but across friendly nations, ensuring that key technology components remain secure from foreign adversary monopolies. And so this is where we sit today. The domain of defense, intelligence, and national supply chain and industry capital is enormous, and it appears as though both the In-Q-Tel and Office of Strategic Capital models will be dominant going forward. There is a lot of money if you can make something that is nationally useful. But to get a deeper sense at just how entrenched this system of finance is, let's go back a little further. Let's see how this all came to be, and just how far it spreads. The United States has a very long history of military innovation, a history that began at its very inception. In 1794, George Washington would authorize the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. This would be the first real home for American defense innovation, becoming the hub for state-managed technological innovation, pioneering a very early assembly line, a technology that would substantially improve America's weapons output. And not long after, in 1798, the American government would award Eli Whitney a contract to produce 10,000 muskets. Whitney would take a very innovative approach to producing the weapons, creating a system where each unit used interchangeable parts. And though this contract may seem very simple by comparison to today's technologies and the sheer scale of modern defense contractors, the contract awarded to Whitney in large part created the template for modern industrial manufacturing and public-private defense contracts. The next major leap would occur during the Civil War. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln would sign a charter for the National Academy of Sciences. The aim of the academy was to act as an independent body to advise the government on science and technology, a bridge between the state's needs and academic research. This period in the mid-19th century was seeing rapid technological innovation on the battlefield. Mechanized warfare was beginning to emerge, and the new landscape of war was very brutal. The following decades would see an enormous industrial boom across the United States and Western Europe, with America rising to become a truly powerful economy, entering its Gilded Age. And so it would follow that in the First World War, the United States would return as an entirely different technological animal. In 1915, ahead of America's entry into the First World War, Thomas Edison would be appointed the head of the Naval Consulting Board, a new board designed to review inventions from the private sector, searching for those which may have military application. Yet while the First World War would see an enormous military technological boom, in many ways it was just a prototype, a precursor for the Second World War. The sheer scale of innovation during the Second World War was staggering. In 1940, Vannevar Bush would convince President Roosevelt to create the National Defense Research Committee, later renamed to the Office of Scientific Research and Development. The aim was to bypass the military bureaucracies by directly funding university labs like MIT, Caltech, and Johns Hopkins, and as well private company research like Bell Labs and DuPont. During the Second World War, in the Roosevelt economy, the binding together of private research and production and the American state birthed an entirely new environment for science and technology, and an entirely new scale for production. In 1942, the American War Department would partner with private industrial giants like General Electric, Union Carbide, and DuPont, and academia, schools like the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Chicago, attempting to crack a new weapons technology, something that could truly shift the balance of the war, the atom bomb. This would really plunge the combatants of the Second World War into an all-new arms race, one not to make bigger guns, faster planes, or tougher tanks, but one to crack the very fundamentals of physics, to tap into the raw power of the atomic nucleus. In 1945, Office of Scientific Research Director Vannevar Bush would publish Science, the Endless Frontier. This work would be foundational to how Americans thought about the relationship between science, industry, and the state. This report would argue that basic research is vital to national security, and that such research required perpetual federal funding, the argument laying the groundwork for the infrastructure of peacetime research and development. The sheer scale of the scientific effort underway during the Second World War created an all-new social apparatus in the United States. The enormous projects like the Manhattan Project made scientists as integral as any warfighter. To win the war, nations no longer needed the best tacticians, logicians, and fighters. They no longer even needed the better inventors and producers. They needed basic researchers, ones who could update the fundamental models of science to crack something like the atom bomb. In 1946, the Office of Naval Research would be established to maintain continuous federal funding for university scientific research during peacetime. The Office of Naval Research of this day would really be the prototype for all peacetime research and development agencies going forward. And even though the Second World War was ending, did not mean that the needs for this research was slowing down. For just as one arms race was ending, another was beginning. The race against the Soviets. The Cold War would be an incredible crucible for American military research and basic science. In 1948, originally formed as Project RAND, The RAND Corporation would be founded by Army Air Forces and Douglas Aircraft. RAND would serve as the quintessential defense think tank, pioneering systems analysis, strategy, and logistics. Though so much of this relationship had been started during the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, much of the formal structural relationship between the government, private industry, and private research had still not yet been formally established as the 1950s began. The Korean War would serve as an impetus, much more clearly defining the relationship and the powers of the president. In 1950, the Defense Production Act would be enacted for the Korean War, giving the president sweeping authority to direct private industrial capacity, provide loans and guarantees, and to incentivize critical defense manufacturing. To a great extent, this time would see both the ideas and perhaps overreaches of Franklin Roosevelt much more formally settled and established into the new state order. And as the 1950s went on, and it became clear that the race against the Soviets was a fundamental societal directive for the United States, the scientific competition between the superpowers would become fundamental to American defense doctrine. In response to the Soviet Union's launch of the Sputnik satellite in 1957, the following year, President Eisenhower would create the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA. ARPA would pioneer high-risk, high-reward research and development through non-traditional contracting, eventually laying the groundwork for the Internet, GPS, and stealth technologies, eventually forming into DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, one of the most fundamental hearts of technological research and innovation, not only for the United States, but the entire post-war world. That year in 1958, Congress would create the Small Business Investment Company program, providing government-backed credit to venture capitalists with the aim to spur high-tech commercial investment. And this would be the fundamental system for the following decades. It was still very much based in that Second World War model, where large government labs would conduct basic and applied research, all while the government provided investment and partnered with private sector researchers, both in academia and in business. Yet the 1980s would be a crucial turning point for that relationship. In 1980, the Boy-Dole Act would be passed. This would be a legal turning point, allowing universities, small businesses, and nonprofits to retain intellectual property rights for investments that were funded with federal R&D dollars. With this new incentive, able to reap benefits of one's innovation, there would be a massive boom in commercial tech transfers and university spin-offs. Yet these decades were as well seeing a shift in public sentiment. As there hadn't been an acute hot war in decades, many were beginning to wonder if this spending was worth it. The idea of welfare queens and lab coats began to proliferate, and many began to wish that the government wouldn't spend so much money. After all, what were the public getting out of it? A real problem here is that even if innovation in one of these labs ultimately led to something that greatly improved quality of life for Americans, the government and the researchers were often quite limited in how much they could talk about it. And so it's very difficult to justify to people that their tax dollars should be spent on something when they can't fully tell them what it even is. And so the country began to see a shift. So much of this research was going into the private sector, and along with this would come a change in incentives. Many technologies that previously would have been investigated by government research were now being left aside if they didn't appear to be commercially viable. And as well, if something would take too long to develop, it became extremely difficult to get investment. And so many very important technologies that were being investigated that really could have been something spectacular were now unable to get the funding that they needed. If something wanted to get made, investors needed to see a return, and needed to see a return within a reasonable time horizon. In 1982, Congress would establish the Small Business Innovation Research Program, legally mandating that federal agencies reserve a portion of their R&D budgets for domestic small business. And as America entered the 90s, Innovation seemed to really find a home in Silicon Valley. Internet technology was rising to be where the excitement and the action was. And with the end of the Cold War, many wondered if much of the defense apparatus was still necessary. So much of America's system had been built specifically to oppose the Soviets, and so now many wondered what to do when there were no more Soviets. In 1993, Secretary of Defense William Perry would meet with defense executives. He would warn that post-Cold War budget cuts required massive industrial consolidation. This meeting would set the environment for the Big Five defense contractors, the biggest and most powerful defense firms that would define the following decades: Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, and Raytheon. And this is where we come to where our story began. In 1993, In-Q-Tel would be founded, and America would enter into the 21st century, with this new relationship between the Pentagon, intelligence agencies, private industry, and academia. In 2015, Secretary of Defense Ash Carter would launch the Defense Innovation Unit Experimental in Mountain View, California. The unit would be explicitly designed to bypass traditional acquisition red tape, using termed Other Transaction Authority contracts to award fast-track defense prototype contracts to non-traditional commercial startups. Over the following years, different military branches would develop their own service-specific labs. Military branches would mirror the DIU by building internal innovation arms tailored to private technology. The Air Force would create its AF Works in 2016. The Army Futures Command created in 2018, and Naval X 2019. Today, defense technology is no longer funded solely by government grants, but instead venture capital and private equity funds. Private investment funds deploy billions into dual-use deep technology, with government entities acting as co-investors, lenders, and buyers. And this new relationship between government and Silicon Valley venture capital has led to the rise of the defense unicorns, venture-backed companies like Anduril, Palantir, and SpaceX. These ventures proved that non-traditional defense contractors could compete directly with the major primes, firms like Lockheed and General Dynamics, for even major program of record contracts. And so, in 2022, the Department of Defense's Office of Strategic Capital would be formed. And in recent years, agencies like In-Q-Tel and the Office of Strategic Capital have expanded internationally, building partnerships with entities like NATO's Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, the NATO Innovation Fund, and others from across allied nations. It's really become quite an ecosystem, with certainly quite a lot of government capital, but an increasingly larger role of private investment. So now let's take a closer look at some of those technologies. Let's see what this Nexus has produced. So many fundamental technologies today came out of this ecosystem. So many of them began their lives in secrecy. The fundamental start to this whole era begins with the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project and the Office of Scientific Research and Development attempted to bring together the top minds, racing to be the first to understand how this science worked and to have an overwhelming edge on the battlefield. The Manhattan Project would develop the first atomic weapons, radically changing the global geopolitical landscape and giving rise to the modern national laboratory system. Labs like Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Lawrence Livermore would construct enormous research projects, setting up entire towns for scientists. The project was of course successful, and set up for the decades of brinksmanship during the Cold War, all because of the government's decision to fund very fundamental physics. Later on, as ARPA and DARPA was created, the researchers would build a computer network to connect military and academic research centers via packet switching. This early computer communication system would be called ARPANET, and would be the fundamental basis of the internet. Both government research and In-Q-Tel would be fundamental in early satellite navigation and radar-evading aircraft, like the Have Blue project and the F-117 Nighthawk, projects which would define modern precision warfare, ultimately leading to GPS and modern stealth tech. Perhaps one of the most pivotal technologies invested in by In-Q-Tel was its deployment into Keyhole Inc., one of its earliest investments. Keyhole would develop an early 3D geospatial imaging software, providing troop mapping capabilities in the Iraq War before being acquired by Google in 2004 to become Google Earth. Between the technology developed by Keyhole and some of the earlier GPS technologies, this research formed the basis of every map on everyone's phone today. One very famous company that In-Q-Tel would invest in would be Palantir Technologies. In-Q-Tel was an early investor in Palantir's Gotham software which enabled multi-source intelligence integration and pattern analysis, built with the purpose of anti-terrorism operations, but with the ability to be deployed to other uses as well. They would invest in Recorded Future and FireEye, pioneering investments in web intelligence threat modeling and cyber threat detection. Some of their investments would touch areas that people don't often think of as crucial to national security, companies like Phoenix Tailings and Sayari. These two would be involved in targeting supply chain vulnerabilities, with Phoenix Tailings focused on domestic rare earth refining, and Sayari on supply chain ownership mapping. Supply chain security is extremely vital to national security, and so having high-tech systems which can maintain oversight over the supply chains has extremely useful application. These are areas continuing to be investigated today, and of interest to the Office of Strategic Capital. The Defense Innovation Unit would invest in commercial autonomous drones, like Skydio and Shield AI. Much of modern drone technology comes out of these research initiatives and government-backed investment. The DIU would as well invest in commercial synthetic aperture radar, investing in companies like Capella Space and Umbria. The Office of Strategic Capital, on the other hand, has been focusing much more on domestic supply chains and manufacturing, engaged both in defense supply chains and basic material procurement, but as well onshoring and reindustrialization. The OSC makes equipment finance direct loans, providing capital for manufacturing machinery, hardware tools for microelectronics, advanced materials, battery storage, and so much of that fundamental hardware and its components. In one quite notable example, the Office of Strategic Capital has taken a stake in MP Materials, the sole operational domestic rare earth oxide miner and processing facility. The OSC isn't paying for research and development, but is instead a financier for domestic supply and manufacturing, in many ways acting like a bank for domestic industry. On the one hand, shoring up domestic production, but as well getting returns from its loans, being a financier more than anything else. What makes this Nexus so interesting isn't government-funded research. That's something that feels intuitive to the public. Though the idea of national credit feels quite different than what we have experienced over the past decades, it's a notion that one can reasonably understand. In-Q-Tel perhaps is more curious, the idea of the CIA running its own venture capital investment firm. But where things get really interesting is in the gray area between intelligence and finance. We have seen the rise of a whole new type of venture capitalist, one very tightly intertwined with the intelligence community and the Pentagon. Perhaps the most famous of this sort of figure is Peter Thiel, founder of the venture capital firm Founders Fund. Founders Fund has been at the heart of so many enormous companies right at this nexus. Founders Fund was one of the first investors in SpaceX. With Founders Fund and Thiel personally, playing quite a sizable role in the formation of Palantir, some of the earliest investors there as well. Some of the investments that Founders Fund has made became some of the biggest name companies today. Companies like Facebook, PayPal, and Airbnb. So many of the biggest tech firms have an origin that intertwines with Founders Fund and Peter Thiel. And because the fund has been so pivotal in backing companies like Anduril and Palantir, it has built a very close relationship with the national security apparatus and intelligence community. This has formed the basis of gray area actors, not quite a private venture capitalist, but not truly a part of the intelligence community nor the Pentagon, sitting somewhere in the middle as a bridge between state and industry. Another major figure in this vein would be Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO. He founded the Special Competitive Studies Project, a think tank focused on science and technology, one at the heart of many of the ideas emerging in this gray area space. Alex Karp is a quite notable figure who has been in media quite prominently lately. He is the co-founder and CEO of Palantir, very deeply interwoven in this Nexus and this new emerging class of defense contractor. Similar to Karp are figures like Palmer Luckey and Trey Stevens. Luckey was the founder of Oculus VR, a technology which has very direct application for military purposes, and as well co-founder of Anduril. Trey Stevens is a partner at Founders Fund, and was one of the co-founders of Anduril, additionally quite involved in the formation of Palantir. In-Q-Tel's first CEO, Gilman Louie, today runs the venture firm Alsop Louie Partners, a firm that sits as a bridge between intelligence capital and research and the broader venture capital industry. Louie is an almost perfect example, making the jump from directly working at In-Q-Tel in the capacity of CEO to being a VC on his own, and that connection to the intelligence community, and particularly the CIA, has not ended. What has really allowed this area of the industry to thrive is dual-use technologies. Today, there are increasingly more venture capital firms who invest in technologies with the goal of national security. Many of them are quite successful, selling directly to the government. Yet others have taken a hybridized approach, making products that are quite useful to the government in national security and intelligence, but as well have application out in the market, dual use, industrial, and state. Some firms involved in this segment include Decisive Point, an early-stage venture capital firm based in New York and Washington, D.C. It was founded by former veterans, including former Special Forces Thomas Hendricks. They invest in dual-use deep tech, like artificial intelligence, robotics, uncrewed craft, and advanced materials. They have made investments into Havoc AI, Firestorm, Firehawk Aerospace, and Aloft. Another prime example is Shield Capital, co-founded by former F-16 pilot Raj Shah, who was as well a former managing partner at the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Unit, as well as former military intelligence Philip Bilden. They invest in early-stage rounds for companies involved in artificial intelligence, autonomy, cybersecurity, and space technology. Another to look at would be Reston, Virginia-based Razor's Edge Ventures. It was founded by former founders and executives of Blackbird Technologies. They focus on high barrier-to-entry national security technology, like space tech, open-source intelligence, sensor networks, and microelectronics. They've made investments into Hawkeye 360, Black Sky, and Black V. McLean, Virginia-based Lavrock makes early-stage investments backing enterprise software, cybersecurity, and dual-use technology. Marquis specializes on seed funding, the firm investing in hard technology hardware for defense and national security. This field is growing. Increasingly, there are more veteran-led firms like Scout Ventures and Moonshots Capital. Many have begun to enter the cyber threat and intelligence specialties, firms like Night Dragon and Paladin Capital, while others are further along the funding cycle. This area has branched into mid-market private equity, with firms like Arlington Capital Partners and AE Industrial Partners. This is a big and fascinating industry, and as one looks at the investments made, looks at who jumps from what board to what board, goes from what agency to what firm, it becomes very clear that this is a tightly interwoven ecosystem, that the lines between government, intelligence agency, and financial firm have begun to blur. So much of this is all downstream of In-Q-Tel, yet that itself comes out of decades of defense innovation and government funding. And while the tightly intermeshed web of intelligence and capital is quite fascinating, perhaps the biggest shift that we are seeing is occurring in the Office of Strategic Capital. National credit of this sort is an enormous shift in the national economy. It is very likely that it will play a larger and larger role as this new economic model develops further. Yet across the board, this intersection of intelligence, military, and finance is something to keep a very close eye on, as there is an enormous amount of capital at play, and this is where one is likely to find some of the most transformative technologies before they are brought out for public eyes. And so watch closely the money that's in the shadows, for you never know when a new GPS, artificial intelligence, robotics, drones, cybersecurity, or even the internet will be born, spawned from the marriage of national security and intelligence with Silicon Valley innovation and venture capital.